Уважаемые дамы и господа, встречайте Стори Tweedie-Yates, менеджер Cisco по продвижению решений информационной безопасности. Интегрированная защита Cisco. Реагируй на угрозы быстрее.
Good morning. All right, I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about time to detection, so the time it takes to actually detect whether something malicious is happening in your environment. This might not initially seem like the most sexy topic, so to speak, so I have a plan B. And in case we're not completely convinced that time is important in terms of security, by the end of the presentation, I'll share my perspective from the U.S. on what the most interesting thing is about Ukraine. But to start with, we're going to first disprove a common misconception around the so-called kill chain. That's the first thing. And then second, we'll talk about why attackers are so fast and what your basic protection should be against their speed. And then lastly, we'll talk about how Cisco can lower customers' total time to detection. Imagine that you have 3 vendors who have come to you, and they've all been tested by the same third-party testing service. And the testing service says all of these products have been tested 100%, they block 100% of threats, so they all have 100% efficacy. However, vendor A says we can block 100% of threats in 5 minutes. Vendor B says we can block 100% of threats in days. And then vendor C says, well, it takes us a few months, but we still block 100% of threats. Can I see a show of hands of how many of you would choose vendor A? Okay. Right, because we intuitively know that it's important to block threats in a quick period of time. But why? Why do we think this? Why do we intuitively know this? What's the data behind it? This is some data that gives us an idea as to why we intuitively believe and know that it's important to detect threats in a small period of time. On the left, we can see that the attacker takes minutes to compromise us. Whereas on the right side, we can see that the victim, so us, it takes days typically to identify the compromise. Now there's a whole lot of data out there that has different numbers on these days, but no matter what piece of data, what source you use, the answer is always the same, that in general, the attackers are able to work much quicker than we're able to work on the side of defense. And what happens then is all of this time in between the time that the attackers compromise us and the time we can defend, this is time that the attacker has to make their way into our network and carry out their goal. So let's be very clear. When we talk about time to detection throughout this presentation, we're talking about the time it takes between the compromise and when we've identified the compromise. So the compromise could be something like malware. When does malware enter our system? When have we identified that file as a malicious file? Or it could be when did the person start using my credentials to send out fake emails from my email account? That's another example of a compromise. And when did we detect that that was happening? We measure our time to detection. Specifically, we measure the time to detection that our products provide to customers. And this is a view over time. And what it shows over a period of about 1.5 years is that we've been able to lower our total time to detection. And in this chart, this shows 1 month. So this shows April of 2016. And there are a few things that are interesting on here. First of all, you're saying, well, hours. Why does it take hours to detect something? I had a vendor last week tell me it took them 2 minutes. We're talking about, with this chart, we're talking about new threats. We're talking about unknown threats. If there's any vendor who says, I can detect an unknown threat in 2 minutes, you should know that something is up, right? If there is a known threat, then yes, any vendor should be able to detect that threat very quickly because we have signatures, we have point-in-time inspection that should be able to block that threat immediately. But with this chart, we're talking about unknown threats. So that's the first thing that you're probably noticing. The second thing you might notice is that the threats have different amounts. So it looks like some threats we can detect them quicker than other threats. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Why do some threats take longer than others? Well, of course, every threat is going to be different, and they're going to be different along the lines of what we call the kill chain. These are the basic components that make up any type of a threat campaign. So first of all, the attackers try to learn about you. They either go on social media, they go online, they learn about what you're interested in, kind of like in the video that was showing before the introduction. And then they need to build up their own infrastructure. They need to build their own servers. They need to look and determine what malware they're going to use. And at that point, when they're set up, they're going to use their servers, use their own infrastructure, and they're going to go ahead and reach out to you. And this could take the form of perhaps a malicious email, or it could take the form of maybe a malicious website, a malicious URL. After they've been able to reach you, so I've opened a malicious email, then they can take advantage of vulnerabilities on my device, and they'll use that vulnerability to exploit my device and take control of my device. And with that control, they go ahead and they install some type of a malware. With that malware, then they say, hey, we're here, we've arrived on the device, send me further instructions, or here's your data, I have it already. And then launch through callback those steps. That will happen over and over again in what we call a persist mode, until the attacker has actually done what they want to do. So let's say they initially were able to get into a network through a person in human resources, but their actual goal is the person in the finance organization. So they'll continue launch through callback until they're able to get to who they want to. Every threat is different, though. We started the kill chain talking about how threats are different. So this is an example of ransomware. For those who are unfamiliar with ransomware, it's probably one of the most profitable malware campaigns this year, at least. And it's what ransomware is somebody encrypts your files and then they require you to pay them a ransom in order to get those files back. What we can see is that ransomware generally also follows the kill chain methodology with a few changes, just a few tweaks. So first of all, they will send a user a malicious email that could either contain a malicious file or it could contain a malicious URL. On the other hand, you could be on a completely legitimate web page and there could be malvertising on that page. And that's how they could get into your system. So let's say within an email, there's a malicious URL. You've clicked on the email. At that point, you'd be redirected to an exploit kit landing page. And on that exploit kit landing page, they'll scan your device for vulnerabilities. And when they find one, they'll exploit it, they'll take control of your device, and they'll call out to their own malicious infrastructure. Again, they say, hey, we're here, we made it, send me the payload. At which point, the ransomware payload will be uploaded onto your device. At this point, they still need to encrypt your files, and they do this through command and control traffic. So they encrypt your files in such a way that they are the only ones who have the decryption key, and that's called an asymmetric key exchange. Unfortunately, at this point, your files have been encrypted and you've been infected with ransomware. Now, I started off saying that we were going to debunk a myth about the kill chain. Well, what is this myth? What is it that we're going to disprove here? What we typically think of is that the best way to lower total time to detection or to increase your speed in identifying attacks is that earlier on in the kill chain, so somewhere around this point, it's better to protect earlier on in order to lower total time to detection. I would argue two things on top of that. I think that is important, yes, but two other aspects are also important. First of all, multi-layer protection is key because attackers are so skilled these days that they can be successful in getting through any one of these stages. So if you only try to put protection early on and at one of the steps in the kill chain, it's very likely that you'll miss one of the other steps in the case that the threat was able to bypass your initial protection. So that's the first thing, and here's how that works. Imagine that you have been infected and you have the ransomware payload on your device. If you have DNS layer protection right here, you can actually prevent the encryption of your files. Now, DNS protection, this I'm referring to our product OpenDNS umbrella. Every internet-connected device needs to know where to go online. So if we know where the malicious places are at the DNS level, we can actually block a request from being completed at the DNS layer. And the important piece of this is that we can block command and control traffic through any port and any protocol. So, like I was saying, if you've been infected with ransomware, you have the malicious file on your device, you can actually still prevent your files from being encrypted. So that's the power of a multi-layer defense. Now, I said that there were two things that I was going to suggest instead of just protection in the early parts of the kill chain. So the first piece was multi-layer defense. The second piece is protection after you've already been infected, not just before, after. So here's an example of how that works. Following on the example that we just talked about. So you have been infected, right? You already have the ransomware payload on your device, but thankfully you have DNS layer protection that's keeping you from having your files encrypted. You probably at some point would want to be able to identify that malicious file so that you can clean up your devices, right? And here's where we get to total time to detection. If you can't detect when a file has turned malicious, let's say initially it looked clean, but then after 2 months it starts exhibiting malicious behavior, if you're going to lower your total time to detection, you have to be able to detect whether the file is not in your network yet or whether the file is in your network. And the fact is, it's not a question of if you will be attacked or breached. It's a question of when. At some point in time, you will have a malicious file on your device that you didn't initially catch. So the second point I'm making here is that it's not just important to have multi-layer defense or protect early on in the kill chain. It's also very important to lowering your total time to detection to have protection after you've already been infected. And that's what this slide says, right? So before an attack, during an attack, and after an attack, all these three areas are important. It's not just one or the other. And the idea of a multi-layer defense protecting after an attack, this applies to many other threats. So here's just one more example. This is actually a local example. I don't know how many of you heard about Black Energy, the power utility attack? Okay, so many people. Right, because this affected public sector, it affected private sector, and black energy is just the name given to this threat, but it's an advanced, persistent threat, and it affected the power grid in Ukraine. So power went out in a lot of workstations, and this is the kill chain for that attack. First of all, emails were sent to people in the power companies and utilities. The email contained Excel documents, Word documents with macros. When the macros were enabled, that allowed the command and control traffic through Internet Explorer to then install Black Energy 3, which was the malware. This process happened over and over and over again, command and control malware, command and control malware, so that they could install more plugins with the point of harvesting credentials. So they were logging keystrokes and basically stealing credentials for administrative accounts. At that point, they were able to create, with those stolen credentials, remote connections to a lot of different workstations, to the point that they were even able to control, when they actually went through with the attack, they were able to control call centers. So when people called in their emergencies, they had actually taken control of and blocked the call centers from being able to help. We know that this threat happened, right? So there perhaps was less multi-layer protection. Perhaps there was less protection after the fact. But what we can see is that there are many points along this attack continuum where we could have protected, especially if we had tried to protect after an attack and if we had tried to put in a multi-layer defense. So let's say that, similar to the ransomware example, let's say they have been compromised. Black Energy has been installed on a lot of different devices, and they've made remote connections to the workstations. If they had had an NGFW, for example, a next-generation firewall that can actually block connections to specific ports and protocols based on location, they could have blocked remote location access to the workstations. And similarly, with segmentation, so being able to control who is accessing what and when and where, they could have controlled the spread of Black Energy from computer to computer across the network. All this to say that, yes, protection early on is critical, absolutely. But these days, you will be breached. It's a fact of life. So in order to deal with this new environment, we have to protect after an attack. And we also have to understand that a multi-layer defense is critical to deal with the sophistication of attackers. Thus far, though, I haven't really explained why attackers are so fast to begin with. What is it that makes them so special? What this slide shows is the attack surface that attackers have available to them. So everything that is in dark gray, this is opportunity for attackers because it represents versions of software that have not been updated and have not been patched. The most updated version of the software is in the blue here, so that's about 30% of people are updated. Here it's maybe 2% of people are updated, and then here it's maybe about 30%. So that second part in the kill chain, or the third part kind of in the beginning, where they look for vulnerabilities on devices, and then they exploit those vulnerabilities in order to gain control of your device. That's the point in the kill chain where the attackers have their biggest opportunity. And unfortunately, their biggest opportunity is our biggest weakness. We've seen customers with really large environments who have put processes in place to make sure that they can control the amount of vulnerabilities in their environment. But what happens is they might be halfway through updating an entire branch office and then they have to begin again, right? So it's the biggest place of opportunity for attackers, and this is why, one of the reasons why they're so fast. The other reason why they're so fast is simply that it's in their best interest to avoid being detected. And they're very sophisticated. So, for example, HTTPS traffic. Many of us think that we might actually be safer with encrypted traffic. But actually, we're simply more blind to what's happening within HTTPS traffic. Attackers know this. And so you can see that they're increasing their usage of HTTPS traffic in order to avoid being detected. So they're very motivated to avoid detection, and then the attack surface they have available to them is quite large. I work for Cisco, right? I'm in marketing, and I could tell you I have the magic solution. If you just buy our next generation firewall, you will be able to lower your total time to detection. Done. I'm not going to say that, though. I won't lie to you, right? Technical considerations alone are not enough. It's not just a question of buy this product, you're done. Most of us know that it's really, so this is the basics, right? I'm probably not teaching many of you here anything that you don't already know. We have to have a combination of people, process, and technology in order to really significantly lower our total time to detection. Here's an example of what that looks like. Let's say that I would like to put together a new patch management process, and I want to deal with the problem that I had just mentioned, where it takes so long for us to update our software. Well, first, we're going to have to set that as a strategy. It's going to have to be our number one priority, and that takes people to set that strategy. We need to organize our people around that goal. Second of all, we're going to have to do some type of scheduling, some type of a patch management process where we know when each different part of our system is going to be updated. And lastly, we have to have technology that can protect us in the meantime, right? We have to have technology that can protect against exploits and vulnerabilities while we're trying to get that process through of patch management. Another example, what if we want to lower our total time to detection of malicious files or malware? Well, we need to measure in our metrics, we need to make sure that what our people are looking at is, number one, when did the file enter the system? Number two, when has the file actually turned out to be malicious? When did we realize it was malicious? And you can imagine that even if a person is trying to do that, they probably can't do that without the right technology. And again, the right technology is going to tell them, number one, when did the file enter the system? And then number two, it has to detect when that file is malicious, when we've realized the file is malicious. And through your processes, you have to constantly be looking for malicious files, or else you probably won't be finding any. The good news is Ukraine is going in the right direction from a government perspective, right? So the new National Cybersecurity Strategy, as well as the National Coordination Center for Cybersecurity. This especially will support people and processes. When we're able to share information, not only just in the public sector, but across the public and private sector, this can help us organize our processes together to fight cybercrime. A great example of how institutions have worked together is the recent takedown of the Avalanche botnet. Who here has heard in the news about the Avalanche botnet takeout? A few people. Okay, all right. Yeah, so it was a partnership of, they're saying now 40 different countries together trying to take down this web of malicious infrastructure. So we're going in the right direction, which is a good thing. All right, so I'm going to tell a little story here right now. I'm from California. I'm American. You can tell by my accent. In California, from a food perspective, we have a lot of Mexican influence. So that means that we have a lot of burritos, okay? I like a particular sauce. It's called Cholula, and it comes from Mexico. Whenever I have a burrito, I always have Cholula on my burrito. However, if somebody gives me a choice, they say, Story, if you have a choice for lunch and I can either give you Cholula, the sauce, or I can give you the burrito, which one would you choose? Well, of course I'm going to choose the burrito, right? I can't just eat sauce for lunch. So what I've just showed you, the people, process, and technology piece, this is the burrito. But what I'm going to show you now, this is the sauce, okay? So we start with the burrito, and then we go with the sauce. And the secret sauce of how Cisco lowers total time to detection for customers, we're able to get our total time to detection from 100 industry days down to only 13 hours because our products share information with each other. Let's say that Advanced Malware Protection for Endpoint, our endpoint solution, has detected that a particular user has a malicious file in their environment. Well, AMP for Endpoint is going to tell our firewall, our next generation firewall, and then the firewall can go ahead and work with another product to set policy and block that user from doing anything else that they shouldn't be doing. And then from a threat intelligence perspective, and I'm going to show a demo of how this actually works in 1 minute. But from a threat intelligence perspective, we're actually able to share information with all of our products through something called Talos. Talos is a group of threat researchers. We have about 250 plus around the world. And they do two principal things. So the first thing they're doing is they're researching. They do a blog every week. I highly suggest you check it out sometime. But they're looking for threats in the wild. They're trying to find what the attackers are up to. But the second thing that they do relates more closely with what we're talking about here with total time to detection. The second thing they do is they maintain infrastructure that can share information with our products. So an AMP for Endpoint customer in London, they have let in this particular file to their environment. We didn't know it was malicious. It's the first time we've ever seen this file. It's a 0-day threat. Well, after 2 months, we have been able to identify this as a malicious file. We've identified the 0-day threat. And so the customer in the UK blocks the threat. They're safe. Information about that threat goes to Talos. And what happens next is the firewall then talks with the identity services engine to quarantine and set a policy on that user so that they can't do the things that they were doing before because they've actually been compromised. So you can see right here, it says quarantine. So walking through what we just said, the file is malicious. ThreatGrid identified that file as malicious. It told the NGFW, and then the NGFW talked to the identity services engine so that the policy on that user could be changed. And now we can see how Talos works with all of this. This is going to go through the process again. So the malicious file comes in through the NGFW, and then it's sent to ThreatGrid for further analysis. ThreatGrid identifies that it's malicious. Now at this point, the information about the file is shared from Talos to all the other products. And that's the visualization you're going to see here. So now all of these different products are going to be able to block this file. Another example of how, so Talos is a way that threat intel sharing happens, but we can also share threat intelligence directly between products. And a good example of that in this situation is ThreatGrid with OpenDNS, which we talked about earlier was the DNS layer security. ThreatGrid has the information about the command and control traffic that this particular piece of malware is responsible for. So it can send OpenDNS information about those command and control IPs, domains, URLs, and then OpenDNS will block the command and control traffic that is coming from that malware. So threat intelligence intelligence information sharing happens with Talos, and it also happens directly between products. And the mapping of the intercommunication, the information sharing between products. So event information, alerts can be sent between these ones. Threat intel can be sent directly through these, but remember, threat intelligence can also be shared through Talos. And then policy information, we can actually share policy with these. And we're just getting started. This is a part of our fundamental strategy in security, is sharing information between products, making it easier for you to accomplish the best of security. Going back to the silly, I'll admit, it's a silly example of the burrito and the sauce. I just shared the sauce information, but this is the burrito, okay? This is what we have to begin with. These are the basics of lowering total time to detection, making it quicker for us to measure total time to detection. First of all, we have to educate our users, right? We have to help them understand what makes a malicious email different from an email that might not be malicious. Next, we have to measure total time to detection. You probably won't be able to understand how you're performing on something unless it's measured. And an incident response plan is absolutely critical because, as I mentioned, it's not a question of if you will be attacked or breached, it's a question of when. So that's always important. But then basic hardening from a total time to detection standpoint, that is the patch management piece, right? That's the update management piece. And you can't protect what you can't see. So your technology has to allow you visibility to see what devices are on the network. And your technology also has to allow you to actively monitor and detect compromises so that you can actually measure when something malicious happens and see it. All right, the best part. In case total time to detection wasn't interesting enough, this is my plan B. As an American, Carol of the Bells is my favorite Christmas song. Well, it comes from a folk song in Ukraine, in case you didn't know. Many people think in history, many people think we're the center of the world. Well, in the case of Ukraine, it's actually true, as in we're in the center of Europe if we're in Kharkiv, Ukraine. The world's first constitution came from Ukraine, which is something near and dear to me. I love our U.S. Constitution. And actually the best one here, I think, is that Ukraine is the fourth most educated country in the world. And there's a funny story about that. There's a wrestler, an athlete, a pro wrestler. He has a PhD, a doctorate. This is maybe something you might not see outside of Ukraine. So I encourage you all to enjoy the event today. I encourage you to go to the demos, learn more about anything I mentioned that was unclear or that you just want to know more about. And thank you so much for joining. Again, enjoy your time, and thank you.